Good morning. I'm Lynn Fegley, your chair from Maryland, and to my left is John Carmichael from the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council as vice chair, and of course our team from ACCSP. So with that, my first order of business is to get approval of the agenda. Is there anybody who has any modifications to the agenda? Okay, seeing none, and you have in your meeting materials minutes from our October meeting in New York City. Does anybody have any modifications or changes to the minutes? Okay, seeing none. And then finally, is there anybody out there in the public who would like to provide comment? Okay. Seeing none. So with that, we'll roll straight into our agenda. And the first thing on the list is to discuss this funding status. If you remember, we found ourselves a little bit short on our proposals. We had a couple of things change, I believe, with New Jersey, and we are still waiting for information from the federal government. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Lynn. And Lynn's exactly right. We don't have a lot of new information. There we go. Perfect.
Trying to figure out how it works.
We don't have a lot of new information. The main thing that we do know is New Jersey decided to go ahead and direct hire one of its ACCSP folks, and just running the numbers roughly through their grant request, that will free approximately $70,000, which is not quite half of what the shortfall ended up being on the worst case scenario. So we will keep you guys informed again, and we'll notify the committee, no longer called the executive committee. It's a team, and I can never remember the name. It
is the Management and Policy Committee.
Thank you. We'll notify them as soon as we have numbers. Again, the big variables, just as a reminder, are the overhead rates, whether or not we'll be charged an overhead by the Northeast or Southeast grants offices, and also what the final overhead for the commission is going to look like. And those numbers are at variance enough to cover the entire request. If we don't get charged at all, we'd be able to cover everybody, and then depending on who charges us how much, we'll have more information on that, I'm sure, once the feds have a budget.
Okay, and just to remind everybody where we left that in October, so there was a motion made that we would wait until we got this information, and depending on what the result is, that Management and Policy Committee will convene to make any decisions that need to be made. And I guess everybody needs to be aware that the money could be coming later with the shutdowns going on. We're just going to have to be patient. So any questions? Pat.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The issue of funding as it relates to more long-term, and I'm thinking about the maintenance that is currently slated to start going down. I raised this at the executive committee this morning. I think we're going to need to have further conversations regarding maintenance and loss of maintenance funds long-term. So I just bring it to the chair's attention as a placeholder for future conversation. I know the several jurisdictions that we're going to be in very difficult financial situations if that goes forward as it is currently planned.
Okay, note made, and that's something perhaps we'll take up in the spring. Anybody else? Okay, so with that, we'll move on to the next agenda item, and I'll turn it over to Mike to go over the results of the data accountability survey. And I want to thank everybody's staff and everybody who participated in that. I think it's a really interesting outcome. We do not have a lot of time today. There was a lot of information, and so I think what we're going to do is do a real high-level overview and plan on coming back with a more detailed discussion on this in May. So with that, Mike, take it away.
Thank you. I think the first thing that we found when we did the survey is that we aren't all speaking the same language, which was a lot like how things began in the program. For those of us that are long-term survivors of this program, I can remember arguing about what a dock was or what a landing meant. And I think in the survey, some of that came through. Having said that, going through this really quickly, what we're looking at is a mechanism to verify our harvest data. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. And what we were trying to do is come up with a consistent, what we eventually would like to do is come up with a consistent standard on how we would like to see that accomplished. To do that, we went ahead and put together a survey, and my thanks to Julie and Allie for doing that. They pulled it together and sent it out. Basically asking our agencies, our member agencies, what kind of accountability measure did they use? And again, if they use some kind of accountability measure, to describe it for us. So that, well, again, while we're looking at it, we would like to develop an accountability standard so that we have some universal measurement that we could use, that we could provide help and also eventually integrate into the tools that we provide. And also data that meet these standards could be flagged in our database, where we could say that these, I don't want to say we would put the gold flag on it, but what we would say is that we know these data have been validated by a methodology that everyone has agreed is sound. So there's some potential benefits, of course, to having the standard in our new electronic tools, especially as we move forward with development or we certify other contractors, that they would be able to provide this level of validation. We would also potentially be able to do a tool that could assist the states and also, of course, improve the data itself for stock assessments and for allocation decisions. And here's what we found. The most common method, no surprise, to be honest, is the comparing commercial fishermen trips to dealer reports. And then after that, they saw them going down there, negative trip. Some require negative trip reporting. Others, also almost everybody does do some kind of a data audit. Less used, and not surprisingly, because it's also really expensive, are the onboard observers and VMS. And then kind of in the middle, we have dockside monitoring and sampling, pre-trip notifications, and hail-ins and hail-outs. Different comparison with data that you might get from another agency, and then finally actually having law enforcement. So what we need to do, what we think we need to do, is some further analysis on the results of the survey. We do have a meeting of our Commercial Technical Committee upcoming, where we could start chewing through this a little bit. We're not at the point where we could even begin to make recommendations. We've had the results of the survey less than 2 weeks, and so I think the main news that we're sending back to you all is that we did do the survey. There are a lot of different methods that are in use, and one of the benefits, I think, also is a recognition that there's a lot of different things going on in a lot of different places, and that, no surprise, NOAA Fisheries has generically the most robust program. And that there may be some lessons that we could learn from them. And I think that's what we got right now for the survey. Anybody have any questions? Really? Okay.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you to your team for getting that done. For me, I found this to be fascinating, and I certainly learned a lot. It was very helpful for me to get out of my parochial view of Maryland systems and see what everybody else is doing. And so we'll have a more detailed discussion about this in May. Like I said, go home, digest it, read the results. But I have a couple sort of high-level questions to throw out to the group to think about for the spring. And one is, if we were to go down this road of accountability standards, the question is, would accountability standards be helpful to you? I think that they would be helpful, obviously, in the context of stock assessment, understanding the quality and accuracy of the data that go into our assessments. But would they be helpful to your state in the context of seeking funding and also support from your leadership to implement some of the accountability measures that could be helpful? So that's one question. Would these standards actually be helpful to you? And the second one is, when I read through the results, there are some states who have some pretty interesting stuff going on. They have they are doing some things accountability-wise that, we in Maryland, it would be very difficult for us to get there just through stakeholder buy-in. And so I wondered if it would be helpful to the group to hear from some of these states who have some of these interesting programs going on and understand how they got there. How did they get the stakeholder buy-in to get where they are? What was the genesis of their construction of these programs? So those are just two questions I have to throw at the group, and if anybody else has questions, lay them on us, otherwise we'll move on. Okay, with that, we'll just move along.
I've condensed 5 or 6 months worth of work down into one slide here because our primary focus today is on recreational data collection. The shutdown may or may not influence the effective date of the regulations for the Southeast and the Gulf. We had a regroup conference call with the folks at the Sapphire program yesterday, and they're not sure at all yet either. They're having a meeting on Thursday with their general counsel to talk it over and see what they think the right solutions need to be. The likelihood is that the regulations will be delayed, but we don't know by how long, and there's also a likelihood that the Gulf requirements may be split off from the Southeast requirements. The Gulf requirements are much more stringent in many ways than the South Atlantic's requirements are. Having said that, we maintained our development schedule through the shutdown because we weren't impacted by the federal government folks not being available in terms of the software development. And we're moving forward, and we're on time to have a testing version of the new version of eTrips Mobile, which we're calling version 2, which you could also call Safest Redesign Beta. But it's intended to run on multiple platforms, all of 3 of the common tablets, and as well as phones. And it will allow partner-specific configurations much more flexibly. The goal also is to allow, an example I'll cite is the gear configurations. The system will allow you different kinds of configurations of gear by partner, depending on where your fisheries are and what kind of gears you allow your folks to use. Our concept for the redesigned system would be to allow each individual participating partner to have a switchboard where they could literally turn fields off and on, or validation lists off and on, depending on whether or not they need them. A good example might be multiple landing locations. We have, and the requirement for a Cell2 dealer. National Marine Fisheries, GARFO requires Cell2 dealers, and each Cell2 dealer has to have a landing location associated with it. That may not be something that's required for folks with estate trip reports. We're on target to have a production version in mid-March on the assumption that we would need it to be available by April 15th. We don't know that that's actually going to be the case, but nonetheless, we're going to maintain that schedule at this point until we hear otherwise. I will tell you that there are 2 pieces that are holding us back right now. One of them is that we still do not have South Atlantic permits. We are working with them to get them. There are some issues with privacy concerns over personal identification information, the birth dates that we need to create the idents that uniquely identify our participants. Those of you who've been around for a while know what an ident is, and we use them. We have made a deal with Zero to have them generate the idents and send us the relevant information, and that's the workaround, but of course they didn't have staff around to do it during the shutdown. And then the other piece is that we need to make sure that we have all of the ports that are in use in the South Atlantic and Gulf into the system so that we have places for them to leave and go to that are relevant to their areas. And we're working with that. That got impacted by the shutdown too, and Joan Palmer's retirement. Joan was doing the work with Jeff, and then she retired and shut down. So she was in this weird limbo for the better part of a month where she was sort of retired, but not, because they couldn't process her paperwork. But knowing those of you who know Joan, you can imagine what she did, which was she kept working. So we expect to have that resolved in the not too distant future as well. I'm very hopeful that we'll get this out on time. I'm very hopeful that it will be, it won't be the be all and end all, but it's definitely a step forward, and it's definitely a step in the directions that we've been talking about, creating a universal flexible tool that'll allow for variations within our individual partners. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mike. This is kind of off topic. I was just wondering, I noticed in the Modern Fish Act, one of the big points of that is recreational fishermen reporting. Would this serve as like a basis that could be put out to all recreational anglers, and will do you see ACCSP having to get involved in getting all this data from individual anglers?
Thanks for the question. In fact, thanks to the South Atlantic Council, we already are. The way that our tools communicate back to our databases is through an application programming interface, an API. And because of that, the tools themselves are independent from our systems. So any tool that can speak the language that our API speaks can provide us with data. So we're currently working with a couple of different systems. The system formerly known as SCAMP, whose name was changed. Release. It's now called Release, and a couple of others that are set up that way. eTrips itself can be modified to manage individual anglers, but it's not specifically designed to do citizen science. But the API that supports it, the data transfer protocol that's used, can support citizen science. And we are actively working, as I said before, on two separate projects. And probably what we'll do is we'll publish a standard API for citizen science, so that we have an easy way for vendors or developers to plug data in. And we'll keep those data off to the side while we collectively decide how we're going to use these data.
Any other questions? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to agenda item 7, which is the recreational updates. Jeff?
Great. Thank you, Lynn. We're going to start off with just a little bit of the metrics of how the Access Point Intercept survey has gone for the last 3 years, and then Alex is going to lead us through kind of the really exciting development for moving to tablets in 2019. So with that, quick recap. The number of angler intercepts obtained by all of your staff has been increasing. So about a 27% overall increase over the last 3 years, 43% increase in charter mode intercepts, and that's been done with essentially the same sampling size of site assignments. Last year there was a 10% increase funded by NOAA of additional site assignments, on average across the states. But that's really good news, and it shows a lot of attention and work that your staff has all put into that. The productivity, the interviews per assignment, has gone up from 5.5 to 6.5. And I've got a few graphs, but one of the big ones is really the percent of eligible anglers that are being interviewed. So during that 6-hour assignment, a bunch of people go by you that have been fishing. What percentage of them were you able to complete an interview for versus maybe you were busy talking to somebody else and they were counted, or maybe there was a language barrier or some other issue? And that is increased from 54 up to 62%. So that's a efficiency of capturing the activity at the site that you're at the time. So that's been fantastic. And also over the last 3 years, dealing with paper, we'll pass these out as a historical comparison. The edit rate, the amount of times that there was something that had to be changed either from logic or handwriting or maybe just a scan or reading it wrong, has changed from an average of about 6.5% down to 3.5%. So that's less time of everybody calling back and forth, figuring out exactly what the data were supposed to be before we end up delivering that to NOAA Fisheries. So a lot of good news there. It relies on all of the partners contributing. That's your state staff, what we've been able to do inside of ACCSP and MRIP working with us on a bunch of things as well. So thanks to everybody. And then 2 quick graphs. I won't spend too much time here. This is the number of intercepts overall. And each state is represented. So Maine on the left is the northern, and going down to Georgia on the right. Reminder, Florida is covered through the Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission. That's why they're not on the slide. But the lines across there show an increase each year of the average. And you can see that within each state there's been an increase over time of the number of intercepts obtained. So that's generally just a representation of how you guys are doing for within each state. And then the next graphic is that percentage of eligible anglers that were interviewed. And again, you see some pretty large jumps within each state. And of course, the biggest jump between 2016 was learning. 2017, there was the social economic survey, so we didn't go down, but maintained the same average number of intercepts. And then 2018 kind of were free to get more intercepts, and that shows with the large increase that's there. So this is Alex DeJohnson. He's the South Atlantic and APIS coordinator. Colby Wilt couldn't be with us today, but Alex is going to walk you through all the information about the new tablets.
Shall we pass out the forms?
I'll pass out the forms while he talks.
Thanks, Jeff. So let's steal this from you real quick. So we started collecting APIS data electronically in January in Wave 1, and North Carolina is the only state from Maine down to Georgia, like Jeff mentioned, that we actually work with the ACCSP. And so the way that this is working now is that as opposed to distributing all these forms and having people fill in everything manually, it is sort of automatically uploaded through this application that we have. So we distributed both tablets sort of differently for head boats and also for site assignments that have these applications on them. They can collect everything straight from the NOAA Fisheries site assignment draw that we house in our assignment tracking application, or ATA. And so all of these sites come in automatically once you're in Wi-Fi. Then intercepts out in the field are conducted out of Wi-Fi, obviously. No issues with that. Then you get back into Wi-Fi to submit everything, and it's submitted automatically to the ACCSP. So in 2019, we will not be distributing any forms. We did release PDFs just as backups in case of any catastrophic failure with the tablet or anything like that. But still, we'd require that those paper forms are then transcribed back into the tablet and then submitted to the ACCSP that way. And this has seen a real reduction in the amount of manual corrections, both to things like your state and county, but also some logic that Jeff was mentioning and helping reduce the number of edits that we're looking at. So in general, we're seeing less time spent in fixing data. And this is sort of the overarching theme that we're going to talk about here, is that this is kind of reducing the time. From paper, it was about 15 to 21 days from the time that it would take for an assignment to be completed until the states, both the state leads and state field interviewers and the ACCSP were kind of working with the data before submitting to NOAA, down to about 1 to 4 days with the tablet. Change to the next slide. Thank you. So this is what you'd see when you log in, and I'll actually show you a brief demo to go through this. But this is effectively the list of assignments, so you can see some identifying information for the interviewer, for the assignment, some really important parts like the date, the time that you're required to be out there, the full 6 hours. And we sort of differentiate here between site and headboat assignments just because they kind of have different procedures, so we color them a little bit differently. And it's just important to note that this is sort of going along with the MRIP implementation plan to sort of have more, or strategic plan, sorry, to have more electronic data collection in general. Okay, so the point of this graphic is to show you that sort of the process has changed a little bit. It's essentially the same process, but you can see on the left we have the old version in 2018 and before using paper forms, which is just more cumbersome. So people were out in the field collecting information. They would then send that within 1 to 7 days to their state leads. The state leads would then have to take a couple of hours to manually input all of that into our tracking application, and then also to send that all in a couple of days to a week to the ACCSP. The ACCSP would then have to work through everything to make sure that we had all of the correct assignments and the intercepts that we thought we had, then to actually scan that in manually, which was another week on top of that. So by the time that we got to the point where we were working with everything, this is that 15 to 21 days that I was talking about earlier. So the states and ACCSP kind of confer to make sure all the information looks correct. That's a pretty big chunk of time, and then the states have some time to look at post-validation, so they call 10% of the total intercepts just to make sure that the people were actually out there and that they were doing the procedures correctly. So we had a pretty big time lag with that before the data were eventually sent to NOAA Fisheries. Whereas if you look at on the right, now we have the interviewing is still taking place, obviously, in the field, but now with a tablet. And this is now a 1 to 4 day lag as opposed to 15 to 21. So we're essentially having this. And what we saw in Wave 1 so far in January, which I'll get to next, is that pretty much 1 day after we had everyone's information, so the day after they completed their assignment, we had it. And then states can begin conducting these post-foul calls pretty much right afterwards. So you're also kind of reducing that recall bias with anglers and trying to contact them. And then it's the same process. ACCSP then submits everything to NOAA Fisheries. So how's everything gone so far in North Carolina in January? Well, there were 131 site assignments, and they are all successfully uploaded into the ATA. We have all of the data there already. I think the longest it took was 4 days just because people were editing it. People are still getting used to everything in general, but so far we've seen a really smooth transition from North Carolina. They obtained 112 interviews on 42 assignments, which is almost identical to what we saw in January of 2018 with the paper forms, so no real difference in that so far. And we've heard from North Carolina staff that this has reduced the amount of time that they're spending for their state staff by about 20 hours with working with the forms and submitting everything in the mailing process to the ACCSP. Each week, yeah, thanks, Jeff. And in general, North Carolina staff have been really awesome to work with. They have put a lot of time into working on the flow of everything to make sure everything works as well as possible, both hardware and software. All states are also working on this in sort of a test environment as well. But as they continue to provide us feedback, we're able to make changes into the application and into the hardware as well in order to make this as efficient and timely as possible.
Alex has a live demo, but we also have a request to go back to one of the graphics. So while he's getting that going, Julie, can you go back to the percent efficiency by state graphic? Lower, yeah, that graph.
They pop up in the background while we do this.
Okay. Then we'll go to the demo.
Okay. So yeah, I'm just going to walk through the application in general to show you what it's like. So right now I'm just projecting from this tablet that I actually have this up. And so this is potentially what it would look like. This is the list of assignments that I was talking about, all the details in here. And essentially I'm just going to click on one of these to go through. We'll pick the top one here. Definitely a bit of a lag. Okay. So we have the details houses everything inside of it that would normally be manually filled in by the interviewer, but in this case we don't need to do that. So we can just move into the site section once it catches up. But in the site section it houses one of 2 sites depending on whether or not this is a 1 or 2 site cluster, which is sort of how NOAA creates these assignments. It's really just stuck there. The danger of doing a live demo.
The audio is popping in and out too.
Okay.
Our connection to the webinar is popping in and out too.
Okay, so it's the internet connectivity.
So maybe we can, if anyone's interested, they can catch up with Alex,
Yeah.
and we can do an offline demo.
That works perfectly.
In the interest of time. In the meantime, and thank you guys very much. Are there any questions? D. Lupton? Well, it'll be Kathy. Kathy!
Good morning. Just wanted to make sure I took a moment to congratulate and thank the ACCSP staff for this work. A few years ago, we had the lovely discussions about state conduct of the APIS and now going into the for-hire telephone survey. And I firmly believe that none of what you're seeing now and the savings in time and efficiency and the increase in the data quality and the reduction of the possibility for so many errors would have been possible without the collaborative process between the Commission, the ACCSP, and the states. And I know, coming from the perspective of a state that very much enjoys working with the staff towards these kind of products, that this is pretty monumental. And it's not just seeing the data being collected electronically dockside and moving into the next advancement with technology, it is an epic improvement in the potential for those data and their quality, and an increase in the data that are available and the timeliness of the data. But I don't think any of that would have happened if it hadn't been for the state conduct and the partnership between the Commission, ACCSP, and the state. So I just wanted to say thank you, and this is really incredible to see finally come true. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kathy. Yeah, it is impressive. So, and it looks like we have a graph. Dan.
So my question is there any take-home points to one or more states clearly above the median and some below? I know back home we have a lot of challenges with cooperation with some of the anglers, especially on charter boats. I'm just wondering if there's anything you can say from these trends.
Within each state, increasing over time shows more, comfort and ability to make things happen, probably better outreach to the anglers. There are differences in fishing activity and other things that kind of are masked in this, but I will say that a lot of states that have consistent long-term staff doing the project tend to get better at doing it overall. So in larger states that have more seasonal staff, it's harder to get the level of proficiency and the interviewing skills to be able to go approach a bunch of people you don't know and ask them how their fishing's going. To be a same face at the same kind of sites as to what's going on. The marine operators know you, different things happen out in the field. So, where states have been able to maintain consistent staff, they tend to do better in the long run.
Are there any other questions before we go into the caddy? Any more?
Okay. There we go. So at the same time we're deploying the electronic tablets, there are 3 states that do the phone calls for the for-hire telephone survey. And the amount of project work is, the telephone calls are less staff time than going out in the field to do the angler interviews. But there are 3 states that do that: North Carolina, Georgia, and Maine directly, and then all the other states are handled through the NOAA contractor, which is Quantec. This year, with support from NOAA, we developed an online call-assisted telephone interview, or CADI, that helps these 3 states make the telephone calls in a in a more efficient way than they had been doing in the past. It's being used by these 3 states in 2019, and the executive committee discussed earlier this morning about moving forward and exploring the options for full state conduct in 2020. That will depend on figuring out the resources as well as approval from MRIP and figuring out their contracting. The benefits are really increasing the state contact and relationships with your fishermen, more direct changes to the vessel directory, the list of what vessels are active in your state at that time, and potential flexibility as the for-hire logbooks are implemented. But for 2019, the procedures remain, and North Carolina has already noted in January that it saved them about 30% of their staff time by streamlining the processes around those phone calls. The phone call itself takes about the same amount of time, but all the things about recording it on paper, transcribing it into an electronic system, there's a bunch of back-end organizational pieces that this tool is already saving them about 30% of their time per week. So I'm going to give you 2 screenshots of what this one looks like. The first is this: as it enters the screen based on the login, it's a web tool. It's part of what Alex mentioned is the assignment tracking application. it automatically selects the current week for calling, and the little telephone icons are colored green if you're supposed to be calling those people that week. On the left-hand side, there's a circle for screens that it'll be able to show you your completed surveys. And there's also a pre-notification letter that goes out. So in the past, states would have to actually create their letters, do the mail merge and everything else. This system that's just push one button, it downloads the information, and you print it out, and you're good to go. Send those letters out to the states. The next screen shows, so if you were to press a button to call a vessel representative, it goes to the next screen when it gets there. And it basically walks you through the interview. So at the top of the screen, it shows who the person is that you're calling. There's a section to add notes, section to add differences for the vessel. If they don't answer the phone, there's a did not answer or answering machine or call back at this time. There's some quick ways to get out of that call if there's nobody there. And then it puts them into the next round of calls. And then if they do pick up the phone, there's a script that at the bottom of the screen which leads the person making the phone calls to go through. In this case, it says, "Hello, my name is Jeff White, calling from the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission on behalf of NOAA Fisheries Service and the For-Hire Telephone Survey. May I speak with the vessel representative?" And if you say yes, it just walks you through all the questions. Click on yes, no. If they did trips, there's a log sheet, and it enters all that information directly. So you need to be online, but it records it and has all the information right away. So these kinds of process efficiencies should standardize how it's happening in these 3 states for 2019. We're really excited about it. North Carolina has been really positive about it, and Georgia's going to start up in March, so they're about ready to go too. They've all been through training and testing and modifications with the system with us, so we're very excited about this development. Any questions on that part? Yes.
Jeff, thank you. Out of curiosity, if you were to call me, what would come up on my caller ID screen? Because I suspect that many people, like in my household, if it says anonymous or it says private caller, we're not even going to pick it up. So out of curiosity, what would come up?
At the moment, the North Carolina, the phone number that's calling you pops up. If Quantec is the contractor and they call you, then their phone number comes up as Quantec, and Captain, it shows up on caller ID. So it's the phone number that is being dialed. So whether it is coming from a state or whatever.
Go ahead, Roy, sorry.
Is there a better way to do that? In other words, could more information be programmed in to pop up on caller ID?
It's possible. It's dependent on the phone system that's being used. So the computer doesn't actually dial the phone number. It shows you all the information in the phone number, and then you type in the numbers and dial it from your local phone. So I think Dee has some input.
So I think the for-hire fishermen get a letter the week before that the call is coming. So in North Carolina, it's a good question. I don't know what it says. If it says Division of Marine Fisheries, they may not answer. But if it just says a local number from Washington, North Carolina, they may. But like I said, they are prompted to expect this call the next week.
Cherie, did you have a question?
So we had staff call the states that were conducting this and just get a general idea. And we got the impression that the cost to do this was higher than what was budgeted. Am I misrepresenting that somehow? And if not, could one of the states that are conducting it explain this?
Kathy.
Did you just say that the staff indicated that the cost that was presented was lower than what they thought it took to do the work, or higher? Repeat that again for me, please.
It was higher than budgeted?
I would say that in Georgia, we have indicated through the RecTech process that the estimated price that was presented was by far a minimum of what it takes to do the work. That was, I will say one caveat, that table of information was without using the CADI system, so there could be obviously the improvements in that. And I know that both myself and Chris from North Carolina indicated that there could be a difference in the, shall we say, ability to get off the phone quickly when you are a state staff member that is calling a constituent and they've got you on the line directly, and they very likely, and we hope they would ask other questions and perhaps relay other opinions and concerns and issues. That's a great opportunity to have bridge building with our constituents that you can't easily quantify in a monetary value. But I think that the information that is presented as cost information is a good starting point, because you have to have somewhere to start. And I know that those data were applied equally in the states so that you had a starting point. But I would say that our staff spend more time per call when they make contact because of the relationship building and the access that person has to the staff member. So yes, definitely something to keep in mind, I feel, as you proceed down the line of trying to figure out approximately how much money it might cost the states to do the work. But it's a good question. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm going to offer one possible suggestion to alleviate the caller ID. Would it be possible in the letter that goes out that you let them know what they're going to see, who it's going to be identified as, and the telephone number it'll be? That would maybe smooth the process a little bit, but it may not solve it completely.
Yeah. Appreciate the suggestion. The desire is usually for flexibility. Some interviewers like to make the phone call from their cell phone while they're on assignment. Some people end up doing it at home. Sometimes the fishermen actually receive an answering machine message and call the staff member back. There's a high variability of how this actually happens, and we've created a system that allows for a lot of that flexibility.
In the spirit of suggestions, has anyone considered sending a text message instead of a letter? I usually get a text message the week before my dentist appointment. It's brilliant because I always forget. But getting that kind of puts me in the mode, so I'm wondering if you would consider sending a text message saying, in the next 2 days, expect a call from this number about this.
The current survey design requires a pre-notification letter. So it's a great idea. We can talk to MRIP about it. The first questions become, of the 3 phone numbers that each vessel contact has, which one is the cell phone? So that you can actually send a text message. Do you have a valid cell phone for each vessel representative? So there are hurdles, there are questions, but it's a good suggestion.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dan. So my question, just real quick, is how much of a problem is the non-pickup? How much of a problem do you have with people not responding to the phone call? Is it a significant issue?
Overall, no. The response in North Carolina has been about an 80% pickup rate. That's higher than I believe the historical is, which is around 60%. But the reason MRIP has continued the for-hire telephone survey is they get a high response rate from the for-hire captains that are a known universe that know they need to respond. So the survey from a percentage response rate still works.
Great. Any more questions on CADI before we go to Julie to take us home? Okay, seeing none. Julie, you're on confidentiality.
Okay. Come on, computer. Okay. Okay, there we go. Yeah. Okay, so the spring load, we've started that process. The participants are due at the end of the week, and we will start matching those at the beginning of next week. If you have the files ready to go, you can email them to us, and we are hoping to have the upload application for that up and running as soon as possible. The data are going to be due in the beginning of March, and then we will be releasing those in mid to late April. The second round of standardizing for species and common names has been completed. The Standard Codes Committee is going to be talking about round 4 in February meeting, and round 3 is actually going to be released to the public in March. So we're going to talk about how we want to handle round 4 in February with the Standard Codes folks. For data warehouse enhancements, I'm going to talk about the improvements to the confidential account application and that management interface in the next slide, so I'll just keep going. Since our last meeting, we've actively worked on the FMP review for herring, the Commission stock assessment for black sea bass, the FMP review for bluefish and winter flounder, and we've continued to work on other species such as shad and menhaden and lobster and cobia and red porgy and some of the other species that you heard about at the last meeting. 2 custom data request highlights since the last meeting. One of them is the Panade shrimp fishery in South Carolina and Georgia had a cold water event, and we worked closely with both the states and the economist in the Southeast Fisheries Science Center to get him the data that he needed to write that report, and he turned that around very quickly after the furlough, so he's got a draft report out to those states. And the other sort of interesting request has been working with DFO in Canada on the American eel stock assessment. So I said I'd come back to this. For those of you that have ever applied for confidential access, especially if you did it a few years ago, you'll remember that you had to download the PDF, and if you needed coastal access, you needed to print it out 16 times and fill it out, and then scan each one of them and email them to 16 different people. And those folks would print it out and sign it and scan it and email it to us, and we would print it out and we would fill out the part that we had to fill out, and we would do the data entry in our system, and then we would file it in the file drawer in the hallway. So that was a lot of paper and a lot of printing and a lot of scanning and a lot of writing. So the new process is there's an online form, and once you hit submit, that online form sends emails with PDFs attached to the partner that you've requested access to, and it copies you. That PDF has been electronically filled out and signed by you, so no one ever has to print it if they don't want to, but we do want to send it to the states so that if they do want to print it for their records that they can. The security contact is then able to log into the system, and at that opportunity they can either approve or reject, and that includes certain options like if you want participant info and things like that. If you feel that the applicant hasn't given you quite enough information to make a decision, you can actually put them on hold. When you choose hold, you can have the opportunity to send a message. That's also true if you approve or reject. So if you put someone on hold and say, hey, I really want more information, if you put that, choose hold, put that information in the comment box, and then hit submit, it's actually going to email the applicant and copy you and say, please provide me with this additional information, and that is also stored in the database so they can see the status of their application. One of the other things we've done is that when a person is applying, they can see their current status. So we're hoping that this will alleviate people from, and they can't choose boxes for things that they already have access to. So if you only need 2 or 3 states, you're not clicking all the states that you already have and bugging those people even though you don't need access to them. So it kind of filters out what you can and can't do. It also allows the security contacts, when they log in, they can maintain a request. So if someone in your state has retired or moved on, you can actually go in and remove their confidential access to your state data, and you don't have to call anyone. You can just maintain the account within there. It also allows the partners, some of the partners have additional files that are either part of their state approval or that are part of the request. So there's either an additional form to fill out or a letter you get at the end, and there's a place where you can maintain those partner files. So if you change your file and it's getting, you have a new letter, you can just upload that through the application. And that means that the ACCSP staff is just serving as support to all of the electronic forms. We've had really good feedback on people thinking it is much easier. There have been a lot of bugs to work out because it's a pretty complicated system, so we appreciate everybody's patience when they got a lot of testing emails with Daffy Duck applying for confidential access. Does anyone have questions?
Yep. Matthew?
Actually, it's more of a comment. So as someone who was an approver in both systems, the newer one is definitely more streamlined, and it's probably a 99% savings in time. So thank you.
Any other questions for Julie? All right, well, this is excellent work. It's impressive to see this all unfolding, so thank you. And with that, would anybody oppose a motion to adjourn? Seeing none. Thank you, everyone.